Alright, so today we're talking about the period after World War II, beginnings of the Cold War, how the world's putting itself back together, how America emerges as a superpower. Now, America had been a considerable power before World War II, even before World War I. So this is one of several. I'd say it was a force to be reckoned with in the world, but it was not the dominant, overpowering nation it became after World War II. Because all the other powers were worn out and exhausted by war. So Britain, because of its financial problems, fell away. Pretty much down to the United States and the Soviet Union. What I mean by superpower also is essentially every foreign policy question in the world is dictated by the question, what are the Americans going to do? What are the Soviets going to do? And even though the Soviet Union has collapsed, America, the lone remaining superpower, it's still pretty much the same thing. Foreign policy questions are always punctuated by what are the Americans going to do? So look at the Potsdam Conference in 1945, the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, the Berlin Airlift, the Fair Deal, the National Security Act, NATO, the Second Red Scare, and what McCarthyism is, and the Korean War. Questions on that? Okay. Now, the euphoria of peace was dampened by the prospect of a new war now with the Soviet Union. Though still technically allies, serious differences between Russia and the United States and Britain were emerging. Russia lost 20 million people during the war. Now, they wanted to claim the spoils of war while the U.S. and Britain are trying to build a new peace in a democratic Europe. So the Big Three met at Potsdam in 1945. It's July, just a couple months after the war in Europe is over. The war in, Japan is still going on. Potsdam is a suburb of Berlin. It didn't have a lot of industrial targets, so it was largely spared the brunt of Allied bombing. But there had already been a lot of changes in the Big Three since the last conference in Yalta in February. So Franklin Roosevelt died, and he's replaced by Harry S. Truman. He's placed on the ticket in 1944 with Roosevelt. Truman had been a senator from Missouri. He's a very powerful figure. The S doesn't actually stand for anything. His grandparents couldn't decide what grandfather name after Grandfather Schiff or Grandfather Solomon, so they just left it as S. Actually, it could have been worse. He had a brother named Vivian. True story. Well, Truman's president. The British Prime Minister is now Clement Attlee. Churchill's Conservative Party voted out of office earlier that spring. Labour Party voted into the slogan, thank Churchill but vote Labour. So Attlee had several accomplishments as Prime Minister, but Churchill never thought very much of him. He once said Clement Attlee is a very modest man who has a lot to be modest about. And you have longtime Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin.
The Soviet dictator?
Yeah.
Hey, is it true that Stalin's son tried to kill himself, but when it didn't work, Stalin said he can't even shoot straight?
Who tried to kill himself?
Stalin's son.
I heard that story. His wife actually killed herself. Except he was a very brutal man. Said his predecessor, Lenin, the guy who started the whole communist revolution, hated him, thought he was vulgar. Now, there's something wrong with the man, so he sent him to the best psychiatrist in Moscow. The psychiatrist diagnosed Stalin as paranoid. Shortly after that visit, Stalin had the psychiatrist killed. He abused his wife, abused his kids. In fact, during World War II, Stalin's son was an infantryman during the war. He was captured by the Germans, and the Germans offered to exchange his son for a German general. Stalin refused. I'd say his purges in the 1930s were based entirely on his paranoia. He killed probably about, there's collectivization policies and the purges, probably about 20 million of them. It's not counting what the Germans did to Russia. That's why during World War II you have a lot of the people in areas like Ukraine and so forth deciding to go with the Nazis instead of the Russians because they knew how bad Stalin was. How bad your situation is, your choice is either Stalin or Hitler. But this is the big three. Now Britain's going to back away because its financial problems. It's basically bankrupted by the war. Spend the next several decades basically trying to recover. Well, Truman and Stalin clashed over such issues as the Polish border. Remember, Hitler made a deal with Stalin before World War II to give Stalin half of Poland. Stalin wasn't giving it up, so Stalin's insisting they compensate Poland by just cutting it into eastern Germany. That's what ended up happening. Clashing over the fate of Eastern Europe, the Red Army occupying Eastern Europe, installing communist governments. The Russians also wanted to rebuild their industry using German industry, basically taking apart German factories and taking them back to Russia. While America feared to settle the cost of caring for Germany, basically Germany becoming a basket case country and not being able to take care of itself anymore. But neither side could agree on how to govern post-war Europe, so they began to divide it. Each side it was decided was to take reparations primarily from its own occupied territories in Germany. So, look here on page 936. See the zones of occupation. Four major Allied powers, the Soviets, United States, Britain, and France, all had certain zones of occupation, areas they were occupying. Dividing up Germany, Austria, and Berlin itself. On to four separate zones of occupation. Russia had East Germany. And so what they did was they took all surviving repairable machinery in East Germany, shipping it to Russia. So the temporary zones of division gradually hardened into permanent divisions, and both sides entrenched themselves further. In Eastern Europe, Russia is trying to set up these communist governments in order to set up a series of buffer states, so Russia would never be threatened by Germany or threats from the West again. So, though promised fair elections, the balloting rigged in Poland and it fell to the communists. Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Yugoslavia fell in rapid succession in 1946 and 47 to the communists, crushing any resistance stood in their way. Czechoslovakia, let's see here, had a democratic government that was revived and was operating. But in March 1948, communist dissidents backed by the Red Army overthrew the democratically elected government of Czechoslovakia. So tensions between East and West were further heightened. So the West now began to see Stalin, man brutally slaughtered millions of his own people, not as an ally, but as another Hitler bent on world domination. A speech in the United States in 1946, Churchill normally warned that we called it Iron Curtain was descending across Europe. So by 1946, the U.S. and Britain refusing to allow Russia to take reparations from Western Germany. Russians continued to communize their own sector, fearing resurgence of German military power. But by 1947, Britain, France, and the United States ready to transfer their authority to an independent West Germany, a democratic West Germany. Essentially, they're going to divide the country, communist East Germany versus democratic West Germany. That's a very difficult situation. See these governments collapsing, but what was your option short of war? And we don't have any. Practically no economic leverage in the Soviet Union, no financial leverage. So how are you going to force the Red Army out of Hungary or Czechoslovakia or Poland? So if you send your troops in, it's war. And that situation is complicated by the atomic bomb. The U.S. had it. The Russians are well on their way to having it. And see, one other thing, after World War II, not only did the Russians take machinery back to Russia, but also prominent German scientists working on rockets and the atom bomb. So basically, these German scientists started developing rockets and atomic bombs with the Soviet Union. So suddenly, the U.S. began taking German scientists back to the United States for similar projects to the United States. So, by 1949, by the time the Soviets built an atomic bomb, the world has now faced the prospect of a nuclear war that could destroy the entire world. Let's talk about Project Paperclip for a minute. Project Paperclip was the attempt by American intelligence agencies to bring German scientists back to the United States. Initially, it's kind of a scientific debriefing where they talk about the projects they're working on, so jet aircraft, rockets, atom bomb projects. The idea is they'd soon be sent back to Germany, but because of the rising Cold War hysteria and the realization that similar German scientists were working for the Soviet Union on these projects, the Truman administration decided to keep a lot of these German scientists to work on such projects for the United States. They'd be offered citizenship provided they weren't Nazis, but several former Nazis were given citizenship. Furthermore, what ended up happening is, as a result of that, the early American space program, most of the early rockets built and designed by NASA were actually designed by German scientists. Well, the Truman administration decided they couldn't allow the Soviets to simply go and take over all these little countries or overthrow the governments. So in 1946, a State Department official named George Kennan outlined a new policy for the United States. It's believed that the United States should adopt a policy of what he called containment. It is, instead of simply doing nothing, or going to war with the Soviets, simply just try to hold the line, just simply prevent the Soviets from pushing back any further. Basically, it'd be a long-term policy. It's not going to be one for everything's to be finished in a week, lots of nice big pretty explosions look neat on the news. No, it's be a long-term policy. You just have to be patient and firm, play a lot of diplomacy, a lot of counterintelligence. But would not be one where the U.S. and the Soviets resorted to direct military confrontation. So what happens if the U.S. and Russia go to war? Atomic bomb. During the 1950s, the Eisenhower administration, the president succeeding Truman, conducted a study on nuclear warfare. What would happen in the United States if there was an atomic attack on major American cities, even just a handful of them? The results of the United States would be devastating. attack on us was a response to the Soviet Union, to Europe. Hundreds of millions dead easily. Actually, it's not just from the initial attacks, but from the starvation and radiation sickness afterward. Eisenhower was appalled by the numbers being presented by the military to him. Eisenhower said that you just can't fight that kind of war. So there aren't enough bulldozers to pick up the bodies off the streets. And this is the situation the United States faced during the entire Cold War. Nuclear war with the Soviet Union. Any misstep could cause that to happen. We press a button, our missiles are launched, 30 minutes later they hit their target, Soviets see theirs coming in, launch all their weapons. Basically, Western civilization, which has taken thousands of years to build up, can be destroyed in the course of an afternoon. It wouldn't be able to do anything about it, except to sit there and let them rot. You can't burn the bodies incinerated by nuclear blast because the radiation would leak into the atmosphere again. And all the stories, those post-war apocalypses you see in some of these movies, said there wasn't any problems with food shortages after nuclear war like that because there wouldn't be enough people left alive to use the supplies. So, containment, basically, just hold the line. No war, rolling back against the Soviets, no war by not doing enough, just nice, even balance. So the hot war, people fighting each other, you have the whole Cold War, people just treating each other like they're at war. Well, in February 1947, the British told Truman they could no longer afford to keep giving aid to Greece or Turkey. Greece is in the middle of a civil war against communist insurgents. The Russians are pressuring Turkey to open up the Bosphorus and allow their ships into the Aegean Sea. So in March 1947, Truman asked Congress for $400 million in economic and military aid to Greece and Turkey. As in this speech, he came to support the ideals of containment, which came to be called the Truman Doctrine. Truman announced the United States in support of free people against oppression. This basically became the opening salvo of the Cold War, which lasted for the next 40 years. But you got another serious problem, though, which is the economies and infrastructures of the different nations of Europe were completely destroyed by World War II. Years of occupation, neglect, bombing. Say these nations were in a shambles. So, you have the Marshall Plan coming about. See, Western Europe by 1947 is still struggling to even be able to feed itself. It's in danger of communist domination. Since spite nearly $9 billion in piecemeal loans to England, France, Italy, and other European nations. Food was scarce and heating oil was scarce in the bitter winter of 1946-47. And so you have this deep resentment led to greater communist voting strength at the ballot boxes. This is the very idea that people are cold enough, hungry enough, desperate enough, and the communists are offering a way out, offering to feed the people. And to a starving population, that seemed like a good deal to them. So more people are voting for communism, more people voting for the extremists. So to halt further communist infiltration, the U.S. decided to throw the full weight of its industrial might into rebuilding Europe in one massive effort. So Secretary of State George C. Marshall, who had been the Quartermaster General of the United States Army during World War II, basically he's the one decided who got what supplies where around the world. Well, he's now Secretary of State, and this is what came to be known as the Marshall Plan. Such a broad policy of extensive economic aid to any nation in Europe that asked for it, including communist nations, including Russia, including Poland, any of the other countries. They said we'll throw the full weight of our economy behind rebuilding the country. This, he felt, would create a working economy to permit social and political conditions that allow free institutions to exist. Actually, rebuild the economy, let those countries be able to feed themselves again. Now, Marshall and Truman had absolutely no illusions that the Soviets would refuse, and order the communist countries to refuse it, but made the offer anyway. Soviets saw it as an attempt to weaken their control over Eastern Europe and refused to participate. Unexpectedly, they ordered the satellite countries not to participate. Even though Poland expressed a very strong interest in it, the Soviets ordered them not to accept it, and Poland backed away from it. In fact, at page 935, there's a political cartoon about it. Western Europe with the new tractors, and Eastern Europe with the people doing all the physical labor. The results of the Marshall Plan, the U.S. loaned Europe $17 billion. Over the next 4 years, rebuilding, feeding Western Europe. And because of this, Western Europe developed a self-sustaining, prosperous economy by the 1950s, and Soviet expansion further west was checked. $17 billion. Included not just direct food aid, but you had soup kitchens set up by the Red Cross and set up because of through the Marshall Plan. You have heating oil being distributed, concrete, steel for buildings. You also have draft animals being brought to Europe. Mules, cattle, so forth, so farms can be restarted. In the early 1950s, say Europe's basically recovered from the war. But the Soviets resented the Marshall Plan. Hated the influence the U.S. had over Central and Western Europe. They resented the reunification of Western Germany by the democratic powers of the West. And so what the Soviets decided to do is basically starve the Western Allies out of West Berlin. That's the thing about Berlin is basically you got the three Western democracies, three of the most powerful Western democracies, France, Britain, and the United States, occupying a part of the city. But it's more than 100 miles inside Soviet territory. They're surrounded by the Soviet army. And so Berlin is becoming a real flashpoint in the Cold War. Soviets threatening the Americans over Berlin several times, trying to trick them or blackmail them or threaten them to leave West Germany. War almost started over West Berlin several times. 1948, we see one such point. April 1948, the Soviets began slowing traffic at West Berlin, which is the divided capital of Germany. And up to this point, you could go easily from one sector of Berlin to another, just got to pass through a checkpoint. In fact, you had people living in East Berlin, they would commute to West Berlin every day. No problem. Just pass through a checkpoint, they're there. So the three Western sectors are like a island of democracy in a sea of communism. And the Soviets came in determined to force them out. So on June 23rd, 1948, the Soviets cut off West Berlin entirely. The West is determined to defend West Berlin at all costs. They're not going to be forced out. but the West realized the gravity of the situation. See, for a modern city to operate, all the raw materials it needs to operate need to be brought in from outside the city. Think about it. Water brought in from outside the city. Food produced outside the cities, farms outside the city. Raw materials like oil and coal, whatever a city needs to operate in the 1940s, brought in from outside the city. So what ends up happening is all of a sudden West Berlin's cut off. They don't have any food. They don't have any electricity. They don't have any fuel to operate. Make the situation worse, being surrounded by Soviet units, the Americans realized what a delicate situation this was. One American commander told his troops that the Soviets decided to attack, they'd all have about 2 hours to live. There'd be no way they could withstand it. But Truman's not about to back down. The question is, how does the state defend a city 100 miles inside Soviet territory? West Berlin has a population of about 2.2 million people at this point. A huge city. Well, one estimate stated that about 4,500 tons of food and fuel, coal had to be brought in every day just to meet the minimal needs of the city. The problems you can see here in 936, it's nowhere near the coast. It's not on a navigable river. Not one that the Soviets had allowed them to travel along. Overland run can't be done because the Soviets cut off all the roads. What's your last option? Air. But all that would, airlift be a remote possibility. Something like this had never been attempted. All it entailed had to be flown in using C-47 transports, kind of mid-sized transports used very often by the U.S. during the war. They had a limited carrying capacity, and there were very few in Europe, so a lot of them been sent back to the United States, getting ready to be decommissioned. But the Allies moved fast, made a quick inventory of everything that was around. In a matter of days, the airlift was underway. By October, more than 5,000 tons was being brought in day and night. The Soviets could have stopped this any time with overwhelming force, but they didn't. And the irony here is just a couple years before, he was just fighting these same people. Now they're trying to defend the freedom of a former enemy. But these are still very lean times for West Berlin. West Berlin was bartered with farmers in the outskirts of the city. Soviet sector for food and fuel, give them whatever they had for whatever extras they could get. One funny story is the American commandant in Berlin initiated his own blockade against the Russians because he cut off a gas main that ran through the American sector into the Russian commandant's house, leaving him with that gas and making him leave. Well, the airlift continued until May 1949. Tension surrounding the situation each day. At a Council of Foreign Ministers meeting in Paris, the Russians finally agreed to end the blockade on May 12, 1949. The airlift had brought in a total of 1.5 million tons of raw materials, food and so forth. Okay, with that, Berlin airlift, the first serious threat of the Cold War, is now past. 1948 is also an election year. Now, Truman's domestic policy program is called the Fair Deal. You had Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, you had Theodore Roosevelt's Square Deal, so you got Truman's Fair Deal. But Fair Deal met with bitter criticism from conservatives who were tired of New Deal activism and liberals who felt it didn't go far enough. Truman actually proposed a national health care system, but it never passed. Basically a system of nationwide health insurance, which everybody would be guaranteed coverage and will be able to afford decent health care. But like I said, it didn't pass. There were piecemeal approaches by every Democratic president from that point onward, but it wasn't until Obama passed the Affordable Care Act in 2010 that any kind of national health insurance even existed. The U.S. being the last industrialized nation to have such a plan. But among other things, he pushed for greater housing projects to help reabsorb returning veterans. That is, cheap discounted loans for veterans so they could buy a house. He also banned discrimination in federal hiring. That is, there was start seeing the beginnings of the civil rights movement. There was more and more people having to realize that look at what what the Germans had been done to minorities in their own country, and we had to look at what we were doing in our own country to minorities. We had to realize that if we're going to be a free country, everybody has to be treated the same under the law. So Truman stopped ban discrimination in federal hiring. Well, the Republicans had regained control of Congress in 1946. Like I said, deep divisions in the Democratic Party. In fact, the Republicans passed one piece of anti-labor legislation, the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947, over Truman's veto. They passed this over Truman's veto. They overrode the veto. Essentially, limited the power of labor unions, basically chipping away at the Wagner Act. Taft-Hartley Act said that there could not be what they call closed shops in industries and factories. Basically, they could somebody didn't want to join a union, they could force someone to join a union, even though all the workers had voted to form that union. If the union is called for a strike, the federal government would step in with a 30-day cooling off period, ordering them not to go on strike. I'd say it's very unpopular among the labor unions still to this day, but essentially it was an attempt to try to limit the power of labor unions as much as possible. Like I say, not part of the Fair Deal. Like I say, Truman tried to expand labor rights further, but was unsuccessful. So, 1948, Democrats kind of despondent about Truman. They said the Republicans had balked on Truman's housing projects. And so Democratic delegates gathered in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where they made fun of Truman's campaign song, "We're Just Wild About Harry," by saying, "We're just mild about Harry." But Truman gets the nomination. Well, the mayor of Minneapolis, Minnesota, soon to be a U.S. Senator from Minnesota, Hubert H. Humphrey, took the podium and announced the racism of the Southern delegates, saying, quote, "It's time this party walked out of the shadow of states' rights and into the sunshine of human rights." Well, those divisions over civil rights between the conservative wing of the Democratic Party and the more moderate and liberal wings of the Democratic Party forced Southern conservatives to leave the convention. So Rockaway formed their own third party called the States' Rights Democrats. It was called the Dixiecrats. And they nominated South Carolina Governor J. Strom Thurmond. Interesting thing about Thurmond is he began his career by campaigning Confederate veterans and was the oldest paratrooper at D-Day. Governor of South Carolina, he later broke with the Democratic Party entirely over civil rights, joining the Republican Party. He was the only U.S. senator ever elected by write-in vote. He served in the Senate for 5 decades. In fact, he holds the record for the longest filibuster on record, basically trying to talk a bill to death.
Mm-hmm.
He stood for 24 hours on the floor of the Senate reading the New York City phone record trying to kill the Civil Rights Act. That determined to make sure that minorities in this country would not have the same civil rights as whites. And because the Southern strategy is still in effect, he walks into the welcoming arms of the Republican Party, beginning the South's transformation from a mostly Democratic to a mostly Republican region. Except he was 100 years old when he retired from the Senate, the oldest senator in history. Died a couple years after that. Like I said, there are a lot of Republicans got in trouble, particularly Trent Law, Mississippi, when he said at his 100th birthday party that the country had listened to Strom Thurmond, there would have been nearly as many problems in the country. Of course, what's Thurmond running on 1948 to become president? Segregation. Well, liberals upset with Truman, think he's not going far enough. Nominated a former Agricultural Secretary and Vice President Henry A. Wallace on the progressive ticket. Except the Republicans at this point feeling pretty good about themselves, so they renominated their 1944 candidate, New York Governor Thomas E. Dewey. The polls have Truman way down. There are several problems here. Is that one thing? The Gallup poll conducted telephone polls only. See, a lot of people still didn't have telephone service. They're not. So they didn't poll those people who didn't have phones. And Truman's down most of the campaign, but the last Gallup poll was taken October 1948. Truman cut Dewey's lead to 6 points. But Truman, undaunted, set out on a 31,000-mile whistle-stop tour across the country, which he chastised the Republican-led 80th Congress as called a do-nothing Congress. Crowds would cry out, "Give him hell, Harry," but Truman responded, "So I don't give him hell, I tell them the truth and they think it's hell." The polls showed Dewey ahead. A lot of people expected that Dewey was going to win. What ended up happening, though, was by shedding the far right and far left wings of the Democratic Party, suddenly the Democratic Party is much more palatable to the moderates in the middle of the country, people who really didn't belong to either party. Next day, Dewey's own arrogance really kind of cost him a lot of votes, too. So Truman stunned pundits and ended up racking more than 3 million vote victory in election night 1948. Look on page 942. Truman gets 49.6% of the vote, 303 electoral votes. Dewey gets 45.1%, 189 electoral votes. Thurmond gets 2.4%, 39 votes. Wallace getting 2.4%. Wallace costing Truman the vote in New York. And basically, New England and the Mid-Atlantics went for the Republicans, except for Massachusetts and Rhode Island. 4 southern states go for Thurman: Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and South Carolina. And Mississippi and Alabama, because they kicked Truman off the ticket. State Democratic parties hijacked proceedings and wouldn't put Truman on the ticket, but Arkansas voted Democratic like they usually do. The governor of Arkansas at that time, Ben Laney, was actually considered for the president of the Dixiecrat ticket, but he refused to take the position. But it goes to Truman fairly easily. That led to this famous picture here on page 941. Picture in the Chicago Daily Tribune. Like I say, some of the early returns from some eastern states seem to indicate that Truman might not win. No one expected Truman to win, so they just decided to have an early night and went with the headline, "Dewey defeats Truman." But late in the night, Truman turned it around and ended up winning the election. So somebody handed Truman this newspaper. He held it up to the crowd the next day. He was kind of laughing at, making fun of it. Yeah, they always thought I was going to lose. Dewey defeats Truman. So a copy of that paper, which you bought for a nickel in 1948, is now worth about $50,000. How's that for investment? The Daily Tribune's not in business anymore. So I'll go back to foreign policy. 1947, Truman administration passed the National Security Act. Basically, an attempt to try to modernize and streamline the military and intelligence services in the United States. Among other things, it creates the United States Air Force. The Department of War is reorganized as the Department of Defense. What's going on with the Defense Department? The CIA was created, had been the OSS during the war. Basically, the clearinghouse for intelligence around the world. Basically, just trying to figure out what's going on. It's not all just necessarily spies being dropped into East Berlin, but it's also people studying information about what's going on around the world from different reports. And also, the National Security Council is created. National Security Council, these are the President's top advisors on defense and foreign policy matters. Basically, a council of experts to study this information, decide what the best course of action for the United States would be. That's 1947. The Air Force is created out of the Army Air Force. Had been a branch of the Army before. Well, 1948, the U.S. and 5 European nations signed what they called the Brussels Treaty. It's a mutual defense alliance. Basically, this is the first time since the American Revolution the United States had signed a permanent alliance. So yes, had been hesitant to engage in any kind of foreign alliances before, but things were different at this point. On January 1949, the Brussels Treaty is expanded into NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This is formed to check the Russian military threats. NATO included the United States, Canada, Britain, and 9 other European nations. So So from Norway to Italy, you have this solid mutual defense alliance. Basically, an attack on one country is considered to be an attack on all countries. And so the U.S. Senate ratified the treaty by a vote of 82 to 13. And to assure Europe of America's commitment, in 1950, Truman named Eisenhower to be NATO's Supreme Commander, permanently stationed 4 American divisions in Europe. And the alliance has now stood for 60 years against any military threat to Western Europe. But after the collapse of the communist bloc in 1989, most of these former communist nations ended up joining NATO, like Hungary, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland. Even the Baltic states have been part of Russia formally, like Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. They are NATO allies now. But interestingly enough, the only time the Mutual Defense Pact was invoked was after 9/11. The United States was attacked, so NATO considered to be an attack on all NATO members. So NATO involved in Afghanistan. They have no serious evidence that the Soviets had any substantive plans to invade Western Europe, especially since the U.S. had the atomic bomb. But the Soviets responded to the alliance of communist countries exposed to NATO in 1955, called the Warsaw Pact. Down in East Europe, militarily to Soviet aims until it collapsed in 1990 after the communist governments were overthrown in Europe. These new democratic governments told the Soviets, we're not participating in this anymore. So went over and joined NATO. And so America, alarmed by the creep of communism across the globe, but not just in Europe, but also ended up happening in Asia as well. China became the big question. And China had been divided into warring camps for decades, but the late 1920s it had come down to essentially the Chinese communists, led by Mao Zedong, and the nationalists, led by a man named Chiang Kai-shek. Well, Mao, leader of the communists, had organized the peasants, the great masses of the country, instead of the urban laborers had traditionally been the backbone of the Communist Party. What happened was, in the mid-1930s, the nationalists had pushed the communists out of the cities and back into the countryside of Western China. Actually, there Mao organized the peasants. After the outbreak of war in Japan in 1937, the communists adopted a patriotic stance by fighting the Japanese and offering to fight alongside Chiang, that is, their great enemy. They tell Chiang, said, let's put aside our differences, let's fight the Japanese together. But Chiang rejected their offer and began building up for a post-war conflict with the communists instead of fighting Japan. So Chiang would fight Japan here and there, but he also would occasionally be fighting the communists, fighting the Civil War while they're trying to fight Japan. So by 1945, Mao and Chiang are at war again. Chiang begged for American aid, which came slowly, but was absorbed by corruption and incompetence within the Kuomintang, the nationalists. Basically, his officers, his adjutants are basically stealing all that aid blind. By 1948, the nationalists had been driven out of Manchuria, and the communists entered Beijing in 1949. By the end of the year, the nationalists were driven from the mainland of China completely, going to Taiwan. They claimed to be the Chinese government in exile. That leads to the problems between China and Taiwan to this day. China is a communist country. They consider Taiwan to be what they call a renegade province. Taiwan every so often threatens to just declare independence, which makes the Chinese upset. But it's been a serious problem in Asia for a long time. Because of the fall of China to the communists in 1949, it meant the world's largest nation, that is the most populous nation in the world, has gone communist. Well, American critics of the Truman administration get angry asking the question, who lost China? The U.S. poured in $2 billion in aid to Chang and continued to recognize Taiwan as the official Chinese government for decades. I'll answer the question, who lost China? China lost China. Corruption of the Kuomintang, the nationalists. And of course, all these problems around the world, people naturally start assuming there are communists at home too, which led to what's called the Second Red Scare. The first one being after the First World War. Well, since 1938, the House Un-American Activities Committee has been constantly harping up charges of subversives in the U.S. government. Canadian spying broken up in Canada in 1945, and far-right conservatives continue to browbeat the government over charges of fostering communists. So in March 1947, the Truman administration began administering loyalty tests. By 1951, the Civil Service Commission had cleared 3 million people. 2,000 people had resigned in protest, and only 212 had been fired for dubious backgrounds, but no espionage ring was ever uncovered. We have a number of sensational cases emerging, however. For example, Whittaker Chambers, a former Soviet agent, later editor of Time magazine, charged in 1948 with a State Department official named Alger Hiss had given him secret documents which Chambers then gave the Soviets. Well, Hiss then sued Chambers for libel, but Chambers produced evidence to prove his charges. Hiss denied the accusation before the House Un-American Activities Committee, but was indicted for perjury. But since the statute of limitations on espionage run out, the statute of limitations on perjury is still intact. And Hiss was convicted of perjury in 1950. It's in this whole affair over Alger Hiss that start seeing another name appearing on the national stage for the first time, Richard Nixon, future president. Nixon was a California congressman, doggedly pursued the Hiss case, and really was ardently anti-communist. And he's hailed by conservatives as a champion of freedom against communism. He used this fame to win a Senate seat in 1950, beating Congresswoman Helga Hagen Douglas after labeling her soft on communism. So we'll get to the real serious problems next time with Joe McCarthy. So read chapters 31, 32 in your book. No questions.